Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast, episode 21, Trauma and the Rhodes Model of Stress. Got a great episode for you today. We're going to present one of many models that we'll probably go through in the next few months about how to better understand neurobiology and sort of everyday functioning, but also how trauma impacts our ability to really take in stimulus and be successful in the environments we're in, whether we're staying in the classroom, in therapy, or other tasks that we're trying to do. So we're going to get a little nerdy today with the brain, but hopefully do it in a very practical way to help you better understand both the impacts of stress and trauma on our neurobiology. So exciting episode for episode 21. And I'm back here with Curt and Jerry this week. So good morning, fellas. Great to see you.
Good morning.
And as always, we'll start with the bright, shiny objects of the week. I'll go first on this, and I'm going to apologize to the audience if my voice goes out a little bit today. Hopefully not, but I spent a good part of Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday in Southern California, where it was beautiful and 85 degrees out, and then flew back to Denver where it was 20 degrees out, and my body wants to go back to LA. So my voice is a little scratchy from all the talking and flying, but great. I was kind of wrapping up two sessions, one in Pasadena and one in El Monte, both in the LA County area. And it just so much fun. 3 sessions with one of the groups and 4 with the other. And it just really cool kind of going out there for the second year and seeing, it's so fun to go out one year, do trainings, and then come back out 10 months later and see what everybody's done with the training. And then further it a little bit more. So it's always a huge honor to work with great people, and also fun when it's 85 degrees and sunny out in February and late January. So I want to thank all my friends out there in Southern California. I know a lot listen to the blog. So love you guys, and I hope to be back out there sometime soon. So Curt, what about you? What's your bright, shiny object of the week?
I've been in a few meetings over the last couple of weeks, and it kind of struck me this week of how fun it is to be a part of good teams that can collaborate and cooperate with each other. So a couple that came to mind was I'm working with one of the county departments of human services on a foster care program. And it was really fun to be in a meeting with budget representation, with clinical representation, with caseworker representation, with foster parent representation. We just had everybody at the table trying to put all the resources we could and all the brains together to come up with a model that can work for everybody involved. And it was really fun to do that. And one of the fun things we were kind of getting organized around was thinking about parent readiness for intervention, either on the say on the biological parent side for reunification, or on a foster parent side around intervention, and how to think about like getting measures of those for when people are ready to go into an intervention kind of mode, and what do we do to get them ready? How do we stabilize the social environment so that they get ready for kind of cognitive information and change? I thought it was really cool to be a part of that and see that group get organized around that concept.
Awesome.
But like everybody had got really, super passionate about it, and you had the budget people giving information, you had the quality assurance people giving like their perspective on it. And it turns out we all kind of think about it relatively the same way, that we know it's really important and we would like to do it better. And that was fun. So that's kind of my biggest bright, shiny object for the last couple of weeks.
Very cool. And it's a good group if the quality and the budget people both get excited. So that and the clinical people all excited about one thing, that is a good group.
That was fun.
Very cool. Jerry, what about your bright, shiny object of the week?
I think that's an interesting concept of readiness. right? And so my bright shiny objects this week, I actually shared this with Matt yesterday, that I stayed home this week to kind of take care of my dog. So I took my dog over to the vet, and we get out of the car and we're walking up to the vet, and the dog starts shaking, tail between the legs. Already has associated that environment with threat. And really there's no cognition there. Really, it's a physiological response. And then I had to leave the vet after her getting her shot, and we went down to the doggy daycare, where periodically when I go on vacation, I have to leave her there where she gets to play with other dogs. And she's in the car and she gets out and the tail's wagging and she's all excited to go in. And, you know, when you talk about readiness and you talk about, we talk about children entering school or clients entering our center, really, this is not, their physiological response is not a cognitive process. Yet later on, we have to make up some story about to explain our bodies, right? So for the dog, we think about how these emotional reactions and the conditioned responses happen outside of our awareness. And, you know, I think that being sensitive and tuned, not just to what people are saying to you about readiness, but really what state they're in, and what kind of cues are in the environment that's going to help this person be ready to either in some ways defend themselves and kind of constrict, or to kind of be open. And I think some of the nonverbal cues and environmental cues are going to be really important to be thinking about. Exactly what you're talking about is about getting people ready. It's not necessarily always them getting ready, but it's the interaction between how can we send the kind of cues that we need, that it's safe, and it's to be able to engage in whatever interventions we're kind of wanting to provide for them. So my dog gave me a really good lesson this week in not listening to the words people say, but paying attention to their physiological body responses.
Which is a great segue into our model today.
Well, I wonder how that happened.
I don't know. It's amazing when we talk ahead of time. It actually flows in a much better way. So well done. The spontaneity we do is just amazing. But so today's model, and I would highly encourage you, if you have a second, to go to traumainformedlens.org. There's a picture of this model, and that might be really helpful for a lot of people to sort of see this in a picture format to what we're talking about. I'm going to do the best I can to describe it, because I know a lot of people listen to this in their car and other things. So hopefully I do an okay job with that, but wanted to let you know that resource will be on the website as well in the show notes for episode 21. And so with this model, the one we're going to present today is really talks about how stimulus in many ways turns into either a cognitive response to what's going on in our environment, and or sometimes a really emotional reaction. And this is sort of builds upon, Daniel Goleman was the one that first introduced this to me. I think Daniel Siegel uses something like it as well. One uses the high road, one uses the long road. I like to just combine those and call it the high and long road, and then the short or low road. Both describes different aspects of these two pathways that we process stimulus. So we're going to talk, and I want to mainly hit visual and audio stimulus, because those are processed a little bit of a different way. And let me throw this caveat out there first. When I say something, or we say something like the amygdala or the thalamus or the prefrontal cortex, please hear when we say that these are incredibly complex parts of the brain. So when we say amygdala, we're really saying amygdala and the billions of synapses that connect amygdala to the rest of our brain. So with any model, as Jerry likes to say really well, it's in many ways, it's a false model, but it's an easy way to understand a lot of complexity. So, and with the high road, low road model, I found it a really good way to look at the biological impact of trauma as well. So again, we're going to simplify it for understanding and teaching practices. But again, the brain is by far the most complex thing we ever saw. I just read a book the other day that the hippocampus and hypothalamus and prefrontal cortex all have their own professional peer-reviewed journals out there. So if you write for those journals, you'll probably be appalled with our simplicity of your brain part, but hopefully we'll do our best. So if you're able to see the page, we know that smell and touch, and I'll just touch on this. These pieces go straight to the amygdala, and the amygdala is really, I'm sure most of our audience has heard it at one point or the other. It is really associated a lot with the fear response or our emotional response. And again, the amygdala has so many other different functions as well. But smell and feel go straight to the amygdala. And one of the reasons we're designed to do this is the amygdala can create an immediate reaction. So if you think about us historically, if we're about to eat rotten food or our arm is on fire, we don't want to have any a break between when we act and when we have that stimulus. So this is why sometimes if you smell something that brings you back to a previous time, it can be a really powerful response. And usually you respond before you think about it. So those stimulus are processed a little different than the main stimulus that we're going to talk about, which is both hearing and sight. And when we talk about the long high road, stimulus that we're taking in our environment from, again, what we hear and what we see goes through the thalamus. And the thalamus in many ways is a fork in the road. And if something in the environment, if we feel safe, which I hope everybody feels safe right now listening to our podcast, then we send it up the high long road. So this journey, it's called the high long road because it goes up through the top of the head, through the cortex, the top part of the brain, and that it's longer compared to the short road. So what happens on a very generalized basis is that stimulus goes up to the cortex, where we really have stored a lot of our memories. And so if you think about, I like to think about driving down the street and I'm just minding my own business, listening to NPR, and there's something on NPR, they're talking about the brain or something like that, as they always do. I listened to NPR, they were talking all about the hippocampus of mice today, so learn something from them. What you do when you're learning something new, like some of you might be doing right now, is what your brain does is compare that to the knowledge that you already have. One of the things I like to say is we've not said in this podcast yet that the brain is inside your head. We assume that you know that. So if you know that the brain's inside your head, when I start talking about the brain, because you have that in your cortex and your memories, you will immediately connect to, okay, Matt's talking about that big piece of jello in my head, basically. And so the cortex gives us sort of that, I like to think of it as the intellectual context for what we're learning or what we're experiencing. So we bring in the knowledge of past stuff. And then it goes into that beautiful piece of our brain right in the front, behind our forehead, of the prefrontal cortex. And prefrontal cortex has a lot of fascinating parts to it in of itself. But again, very simply put, is that the prefrontal cortex allows us to bring executive functioning to the situation. So let's again say I'm listening to something on NPR, I'm getting new information about the brain, I'm comparing it to the information I already have about the brain. And then I might be thinking about, okay, how's this apply to a client I might be working with? Or how's this apply to how I'm going to do a training next week? So the prefrontal cortex allows us to kind of think out of how we use things, plan towards the future, and it also helps us to regulate emotions as well. So incredibly complex, and really the prefrontal cortex is what's sort of unique about us as human beings, is we have that as part of our evolution have developed this amazing frontal part of our brain that allows us to really think out. I love the example as, especially my dogs. I don't know about you guys, but your dog rarely saves some food for retirement, right? Dogs, if there's food out, they're going to eat the food. There's not like, maybe if I save some food, I'll store this up just in case Mad Duck forgets to feed me, and then I'll have this sort of in reserve. So this allows us to delay gratification and do a lot of other stuff that's very intellectual. Then the final piece of the high long road journey goes into the amygdala. Now, the amygdala here on the high long road really provides the emotional context. So again, if I'm learning about something about the brain, again, the cortex is adding what I already know to it. Prefrontal cortex, I can kind of think about how I could use this, and then it hits the amygdala, and that provides the emotional context for what I'm experiencing in the environment. So maybe I'm thinking about a client, and I'm worried about that client because maybe their family is going to get evicted. So that's where that emotional context to the experience is in. Maybe they left me 35 new voice messages last night. I'm a little frustrated with them. So that's where that frustration can come in as well. And so really that then provides that emotional context. And it's important to understand, while, I took maybe 5 minutes to explain this incredibly complex thing, just in the time that I explained that, your brain has sent billions probably of stimulus, both of what I'm saying, but also everything that's happening around you in the environment through this high, long road. So I want to just kind of open it up and see if Curt or Jerry, either of you have kind of this intellectual pathway in our brain in this model, anything to kind of add thoughts to what I briefly presented.
Curt,
I
get back there thinking, so I'm like,
I was just thinking about kind of a behavioral perspective on that, and how there are a couple of things from an article written by a guy named William Baum. He published it in like 2012, and he talked about two different kind of types of environmental events. One that would be types of events that are important across generations, and then other types of events that would be important within the lifetime of an organism. So he used big words to talk about those, right? If they're important across generations, then he called them phylogenetically important events. And if it's within the lifetime of the organism, that's ontogenetic. And so kind of thinking about this idea of certain sensory events that come through certain sensory modalities go right to different areas of the brain would be a great way from a physiological standpoint to think about what kinds of events become phylogenetically important versus happening within the lifetime of the organism. And they certainly have a huge effect on behavior. Like you could probably argue that events that are important across generations would be much more likely to go the short road than the long road. And if they're important within your lifetime, they may go the long road. So just kind of differences in how our physiology would then impact how we respond to the environment, and how the environment giving feedback would have a different kind of valence depending on which type of event it is. Those are some of the thoughts that I had while you were talking about.
Do you have any thoughts on examples of each of those? I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
What you just said. I think it'd be great. I'd love to get an example of each if you
have. I mean, an easy one for phylogenetically important events is food. Mm-hmm. You're going to talk about the primary kind of reinforcers versus what we call secondary reinforcers. So primary reinforcers are events that are or objects within the environment that are important to our survival. So food, shelter, sex, companionship, like all of those kinds of things, water, like they don't really require any learning history to be important. Other things can become paired with those, like money. Money has no value other than what it is paired with that we can get with it. So it becomes what we would call a secondary reinforcer. Hugely motivating to behavior, obviously, but it only holds value, only holds motivational value because of its association with phylogenetically important events.
Very cool. Awesome. Thank you for that. That's fascinating. Jerry, you got any thoughts on this, on my initial overview of this high, long road?
Well, as I listened to both of you, the name that popped up is Jacques Ponsek's work, looking at really the lower parts of the brain, really without kind of verbal cognition or kind of the more instinctual kind of behaviors that I think you're talking about go across generations, and things like seeking behaviors. So you're seeking food, you're seeking water, you're seeking some reward in your environment. where he talks about anger, aggression, fear, lust, also caring, and that all of these are instinctually mediated by the lower parts of the brain. So information from the external world comes in and activates those. And then he moves up to more of the, what we would call the limbic system. And then you have more of those conditioned kind of responses that we learn in our environment, right? And really we share those two levels with other mammals that kind of do it. But what makes primates, and especially humans, kind of unique is our ability to not only have a sensory experience and then to represent it in our mind, but we could re-represent it and then make some decisions and choices about how to respond to those things. And so, you know, I think that what we're talking about really is this hierarchical process that we have access to, both a way to kind of respond to the environment in an instinctual way that we've learned over generations, and then a way to kind of take in information that we've learned over our lifetime, and then a part of our brain that has a capacity to make a decision on how to respond to those types of things, right? Yep. And that is all, in some ways, what I'm sure we'll get to is how accessible is that last part of our brain to be able to integrate this information from our bodies, from our emotional states, and then into our thoughts to kind of make some decisions about how to respond to stimuli in our environment.
Absolutely.
One of the ways that this kind of goes in a lot of the behavioral literature is, it's a pretty interesting concept, I think, of that if for the environment essentially to select certain behavior, certain responses to be likely to be repeated again in the future is one of the basic concepts of behavioral development. There needs to be a substrate of variability from which the environment can make selections. And one of the impacts I see of trauma is that you get a reduction in the amount of variability that actually happens. So you can get kind of the freeze response happening, right? I mean, you can imagine being, you know, you get kind of two problems. One is too much variability, one is too little variability, where you get on the hyperarousal side so much behavior happening that it becomes problematic. And on the other side, on the dissociation side, you get so little behavior happening that it's hard to get the right responses or more desirable responses interacting with the environment so that they are selected. So that's kind of the concept of exposure to naturally occurring contingencies. If you don't have much behavior going on, it's kind of hard to get the environment to interact with that behavior. So there are a couple of kind of problems that start to happen when the brain structures get either overexcited and generate a lot of variability in behavior, or kind of get into the freeze side of things and you get very little behavior from which you can start to select new responses to happen.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And so when we've kind of, especially with those fight and flight, those hyper aroused behaviors, that really talks a lot about the short, low road. And so if you do have the picture in front of you, really, like I said, let's put me back out. I'm driving down the interstate, listening to NPR. I'm on that high, long road. I'm learning about, you know, this new study about the hippocampus of mice and these new cells for the stress response. I'm digging NPR. All of a sudden, a car swerves over into my lane. Now, in that moment, again, I see the car coming, so that's stimulus coming my way. In that moment, I shift, and the thalamus is no longer sending up the high, long road, but shifts it straight down to the amygdala. And if you don't have the picture right in front of you, the thalamus is right in the center part of the brain, and the amygdala is right underneath it. And the amygdala is sort of right next to what's also called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, adrenal, pituitary, right?
Yeah.
All right, I got that. So, it's been a long week. And so all this kind of stress response is right there. So if I see a car swerving over, pretty much immediately, this is why it's the short road, all of a sudden I trigger this extreme stress response. With what Curt was saying, that hyper aroused is that car swerving over. For most of us, we're going to immediately get out of the way. Now, I no longer really care about the NPR study I'm listening to. I have no empathy for the person cutting me off. My whole reality now becomes about a stress response to get immediately away from what's causing me stress. Now, there may be a few action heroes out there that would trigger the fight response, which means you would take your car and swerve it over into the car coming at you. Most of us wouldn't do that necessarily. But that is that real intense response. So again, with the amygdala, this is where it sort of takes over and starts to trigger, again, the HPA response, which, and then the body creates that, releases cortisol. And I know when I get cut off in traffic, especially if I'm going, in Colorado, you can drive like 75 on the interstates here. It's an immediate, intense response where we have that within a split second, we're keeping ourselves safe. And so, again, when we see things, we can really have that low road response, which probably has kept most of us alive. Now, a lot of times, unfortunately, as we'll talk about soon, folks with a history of complex trauma might activate that response even in situations where we may not see any threat in the environment, and it can often get them behaviorally in trouble. But we really have this great mechanism in our brain to keep us safe. And I'm sure we've all been there at one time or the other. And so just kind of before we talk about kind of the trauma's impact on all of this, any other thoughts or to add about the low or short road?
In the brain, information is traveling and being processed at each level of the brain, right? And so in some ways, what you're saying is there are times that the environment demands the threat, the danger and the threat to our lives demand that we process information at a lower level and have a response immediately to that part, right? And in that situation is that we have a down regulation. It doesn't get processed at this higher level, right? So why you see people in those situations engage in behaviors that they might not engage in other situations. So you get road rage, right? Because in a way their body's reacting and shutting down, in some ways shutting down the top part, but the information is not even getting there. What you described is this incredibly rapid reaction to an environmental stimuli, right?
Yeah.
So that really is very adaptive. It would be terrible for you to have to think about, I have to move my car, you would be hit already, right? So what I think it's really important to begin to see is that that is an adaptive response to an environmental stimuli, right? What we see in trauma is that gets trapped, right? And so this concept of, that we've talked about it a little bit, but this concept of to be able to take information from the environment and integrate it into an already map you have to assimilate it, right? What we do later on is we start to accommodate and we start to separate. For trauma victims, they don't have the second part of it. They assimilate information from their environment, but they don't accommodate it, so they don't begin to realize that they're not on the road and a car's coming at them. Everything that happens to them that creates a stress response is a danger.
Absolutely.
Some of us have the ability to have those kind of experiences, and later on we're in the office and somebody says something and our body reacts, but we're able to say, oh, we're not in a dangerous situation. Trauma victims get stuck in processing information through a map that's already been created rather than accommodating to new information. So I think that's a really good example of when that's adaptive. But if you were in your office and somebody knocked on the door and you experience it in your body that's a car coming at you and you started yelling at the door, that same behavior would be maladaptive, right? So it's not the behavior that's adaptive, it's the context in which the behavior is being exhibited.
Excellent point. And I always encourage, I want to get your thoughts on this too, but I like to always remind people that I'm teaching this to too, is most of us are lucky enough. Now when we talk about the trauma, people growing up in dangerous situations, is my life hasn't been threatened seriously in a while. Like I haven't had to have the fight or flight response. I'd have to really think back about when the last time I had to either move quickly to get away from something that was going to hurt me, or fight a stressor that might also hurt me. But I think when we think about how our brain developed evolutionarily, there used to be a lot of threats in our environment. So, when I worked with especially gang members who were growing up in basically what was a war zone in Indianapolis, where I started my career, where we were one of the murder capitals of the United States for a few years back then. I mean, this hyper aroused, always being at that edge of the fight and flight, it was a lot safer for them to have a reaction, even if there wasn't danger in the environment, because, hey, if I kick your butt and you weren't trying to shoot me, I'm still alive for another day. And there was so much threat in the environment. Now, obviously, translate that into a school environment or other things, and that becomes a very hindrance to their success in other areas. But, I always like to remind people that really our brain, at least I see our brain, is primarily designed to keep us alive. And it does an amazing job of that. I mean, just think about how often we commute to work and how dangerous that is. And our brain keeps us going. But it's this low road really reminds us that, we grew up as a species with a lot of things trying to eat us or hurt us. And so we've got these systems, even though some of us are lucky enough and privileged enough not to have to use them all that much, which I think is just a reminder where some of our clients may have survived violent homes or violent environments because they were able to be highly reactive and keep themselves safe. Again, later on, that could cause problems. But Curt, anything else to add to this? I'd love to get your behavioral perspective.
I think it's a pretty interesting kind of step to take with the idea of the selection by consequences, which is also kind of the same as serve and return. Like for me, those are the two concepts that really kind of speak to each other across the two worlds of a trauma world and a kind of more behavioral world. And one of the things that when you talk about emotional states and the low road and some of the actually internal things that happen when we get kind of triggered in those situations, right? When you get under threat, the internal workings of the body have also developed mechanisms to select behavior in a much similar way that external world can do. Right? So if you think about getting cut off and being under danger, you get feelings associated with that you would like to avoid. They're unpleasant. And so you then change your behavior in order so that those things don't happen. Right? If you take your traffic example, you start following people with a much greater distance so that you're not slamming on the brakes when somebody slams on the brakes in front of you and you have that increase in heart rate, a little pit in your stomach that happens, right? We learn to avoid that feeling. So the internal workings of the body have developed mechanisms phylogenetically, right, across generations that can help to select our behavior in concert with environmental events. So the two work together with each other to help to shape our behavior to be very adaptive in the world. It's also the side of it that can make it maladaptive when it starts going too far in the wrong direction and we get chronic stress that's unpredictable, that is chaotic in nature, there's no pattern to it. That can develop some problems for our body working in concert with, or in kind of synonymously or in synergy with the environment. When those two things get off, then we get maladaption instead of adaption. Great point.
And I want to get into some of the.
So Matt, I want to kind of just jump back for a second.
Go for it.
When you mentioned that we live in a different world in which, there's not these harsh threats to our environment, and kind of looking at it is that when we look at, in John Bowlby's kind of concept of environments of evolutionary adaptiveness, you think back to prehistoric man, and they lived in this world in which food was scarce, in which there were things that can eat them. They could fall and get an injury and die because there wasn't medicine, there were all these physical threats.
Mm-hmm.
But they also lived in hunter-gatherer groups with 40 to 50 people, and there was constant relational interactions, right? And so their physical world was more dangerous, but in some ways their relational world was more connected. Lots of the clients that we work with may not have the kinds of threats, right? So in some clients, they do have the physical threats, but they may not. But lots of the clients we get to come from environments in which there's relational scarcity, right? And so you may have a single mom that's trying to raise a baby, or you have a family that's isolated, or they're depending. And so if we just look at the environment and say, what are the threats in their environment relative to prehistoric times, there may actually be less, but their ability to regulate their nervous system within a safe relational milieu is also less. So I think that today we have far less connectedness in our relational environments than there were back in prehistoric times.
Yeah.
Which makes us also vulnerable in different kinds of ways. So I really want to kind of help us understand why today, how many things that we see as threats to our homeostatic mechanisms that in a way we wouldn't identify as physical threats. But a child who grows up in a home and there's violence, or there's even in their home, and then they go out in the street and there's lack of safety, or school, their body is constantly telling them they're in danger. No different than we were back in prehistoric time, but for different reasons. So I think we have to put what we define as threats, right? So my dog going to that vet, there was not a real threat there at this time, but his body was telling him there's a saber-toothed tiger in that building.
Right.
Absolutely.
Do you think, Jerry, if you could kind of extend that point a little bit, right? I mean, that could be one way in which once in that kind of an environment, once the actual physical threats that start to generate a trauma response subside, it would allow the brain to take more of this long road than the short road. And so then that part of our cortex that allows us to simulate things and anticipate things in the environment can become active and actually exacerbate the emotional response and the stress that we go through when we try and predict everything based on a model right.
That's trauma sensitive treatment, right? You just described what, right? So in the safety of a relational safe environment, I'm able to begin to integrate this experience into my overall, the experience doesn't go away, but my ability to be able to respond to that stimuli in a different way allows me to make different choices and doing exactly what you said.
Right.
So these triggers in the environment activate a biological response that interferes with the ability to accommodate that information into a larger integrated map of the world that allows me to have an ability to make a decision how to respond as opposed to instinctually responding in a threat response to do it. Exactly.
It really makes, when you're saying that, Jerry, too, as well, is like, I just think about so many of the, whether I'm working with them when they're in their teens or as children or later on when they become adults, is like, boy, because we're not really most of us don't grow up in a larger family system or tribe, that dysfunctional, if there's a high level of dysfunction and maybe even danger in the home environment, and I just think about my kids that ended up joining gangs. I mean, they were looking for that safety in numbers, and none of us wanted them to look there for it, but that was all that they had for that relational piece. And I think, again, how important it is that whether they're in gangs or not, but people coming, kids or later on adults coming out of those homes where they really grew up with that danger sort of always present, the saber-toothed tigers coming home at night every night and in the house, is just shows the importance of how we can establish, whether we're a teacher in a school, a therapist, a case manager, how helping them establish a healthy relationship can both help regulate and help them start to reestablish some of those integrative maps.
Exactly. So you're looking at not only the behavior, the traumatic behavior, but you're trying to understand what's the historical relational environment in which these exposures took place, and then what is the current relational environment in which the healing is going to have to take place.
Yep.
Right? Is that if we're trying to kind of map out those, and the neurosequential model, Dr. Perry's does a really nice job of looking at both the relational environments and the adversity. And if the relational environment is still chaotic and threatening, then really you could do all the work you want in the world, but that individual, child or adult, is going to keep reacting, which is adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of create some relational safety, create a therapeutic web that's safety, then our interventions can begin to help that person really create an integration of that allows them to make a different response to the environment, right? So you have to both be looking at the individual, but the relational environment in which those contexts took place.
Absolutely. I want to get because we're running a little low on time. I want to get to the rest of the brain here. And one last thing, and then this works both on the high road and the low road, but a little different ways, is this little worm-looking thing in our brain called the hippocampus. And hippocampus plays a lot of functionings, but one of the key ones it does, especially with the low road, and let's go back to me getting cut off in traffic, is, let's say I'm safe. I get out of the way. I swerve into the other lane, and I get on the train, maybe, or back on the road, and maybe I'm flipping somebody off, maybe I'm not, depending on my regulation at the time. But that the hippocampus plays a key role to help us get back to regulation, and that when we have triggered that sort of amygdala short road response, the hippocampus is incredibly important, because once we start to see that, and I like the driving analogy, because when we see the person that cut us off in our rear view mirror, all of a sudden we're starting to see that, okay, the threat has actually physically passed us. And it may, if you remember last time you've been cut off in traffic, you're still holding some of that anxiety. But then for most of us, we start to recover at that point. We start to shift back up that high, long road. And so hippocampus plays a key role in there on both of these roads too. It also, just to say, the hippocampus plays a critical role in memory development as well. So plays two critical roles and many more than that. Again, I think hippocampus is one where they write a whole journal about it. So I want to talk, though, about the biological injury that we see in this model of what happens when somebody grows up in traumatic situations that don't get that support, that are really in that survival mode. So there's several things with this on both the high road and the short road. The short road, one of the things that we see is that there's more activation showing up on brain scans of the amygdala. That the short road is activated more, and we actually now I'm reading really concrete studies about the amygdala and folks with that unresolved trauma. Again, I always like to say this biology can always be healed with the right treatment and the right environmental changes, but that the amygdala is actually bigger in size. And so I see that manifest itself with clients I've worked with and behaviors is all of a sudden more things seem to be threats in the environment. I'm more likely to have that hyper aroused, that fight or flight response. So biologically, again, and think about the gang members I worked with is, boy, they always wanted to be on the lookout for the next drive-by shooting or the undercover cop. Or maybe if they were selling drugs on the corner, which most of my clients were, who might try to steal my drugs. And so always being in that amygdala mode was actually in some ways, a really good survival thing for them. The other thing with that low road functioning is we actually now have good brain scan evidence that the hippocampus is smaller in size as well. So not only do I see more things as threats, I get reactive in that fight or flight modality, but it's harder for me to come back down to regulation when that low road is triggered. And I think most of us can resonate with, we're working with somebody, all of a sudden something triggers them. We may not identify what exactly it is, and we're trying to de-escalate, but they just keep escalating, and nothing we seem to do it. And biologically, for some folks with trauma histories, it's harder for them to get back down into regulation. So when we just look at this low road, bigger amygdala, smaller hippocampus, and the smaller hippocampus also has a lot of consequences for memory development as well. So we see that come into play with academic success and other things as well. So I've got a few things about trauma in the high long road, but I want to see any thoughts on this biology, because I see this play out. Jay, this was one of the things when you sat me down with the ACE study and started talking about the amygdala, 13, 14 years ago. It's like, oh, these are our kids. And so I'd love to get you guys' thoughts on this biology.
You kind of described a collection of symptoms that I've also seen a lot, as I'm sure many people have, in that the difference between when you or I feel safe and regulated is completely the opposite of when somebody who's been traumatized feels safe and regulated. So I feel safe and regulated when I'm not hypervigilant, when I'm not scanning the environment for danger every second. And somebody who has gone through a lot of traumatic experiences doesn't feel safe when they are not hypervigilant. They feel safe when they are hypervigilant. And as soon as they aren't hypervigilant, the drive starts to be to become hypervigilant, because that's where safety is. That's get back right into homeostasis and kind of where we live, and the difference between states and traits, and those concepts kind of come back into play. I saw this over and over and over again over many years, and saw biological measures of it and differences in heart rate and what drove things. So yeah, I think hugely just a hallmark of what it is like to experience trauma is being hypervigilant feels safe, and you want to stay safe.
Yep. And I would encourage our listeners, don't just skip over what Curt just said, because I think it's such an important thing. Is sometimes the behaviors that we see, again, that get our folks in trouble a lot of times, are actually them trying to reestablish a homeostasis, that they actually feel safer and more regulated when their heartbeat goes up and they become in that reactive mode. And that's a huge lesson you've taught me over the years. And I think something that I've really held on to is, again, counterintuitive if we're thinking from our perspective. But if we look at the heart rate stuff that you talked about in the past, really important insight there. Jerry, any thoughts on this?
In the sake of time, because what you said, we could spend another 3 podcasts talking about some of the things you talked about, right? But I want to kind of leave the listeners with this idea, that for many of our clients who have been exposed to high levels of stress for a prolonged amount of time, in your model thinking, that information doesn't get integrated into this top level where we have verbal memories that we can recall up. And so lots of their memories are symptoms, right? And so they become, if you want to use, Curt's language, they become conditioned to respond to stimuli in the environment in a particular way that elicits a response from their body. Those are memories, and they don't have language to put to them. So we really have to be sensitive based on the idea that not all the time we have access to this really unique part of our brain that makes us unique in the animal kingdom, that allows us to process. So trauma, in some ways, had been defined on somebody having memories of a past experience, right? For our clients, oftentimes they have behavioral patterns that are their memories. you're not going to go in there and say, can you tell me that there's 3 things in your life that made you traumatized, right? They have continually re-experiencing those things. So I think if we begin to take a lens to look at our clients and look at their behavior, whether they can put them onto some concrete memories or give us a narrative, that's great. But oftentimes we have to begin to understand what would it be like to live in the world having to respond to the world and what's the way their body is seeing it.
Absolutely.
And then how do we then provide them some experiences that helps them down-regulate their kind of stress response, right? What pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity do we need to give them to help them feel safer, not only with us, but in their own bodies, that allows them to begin to integrate some of this stuff into having an ability to respond to the world differently. So I think understanding that there's this higher processing that you talk about and this more instinctual way of responding, lots of our clients are stuck in this instinctual way of responding that has been, in some ways, we've carried with us through our ancestral history to kind of keep us safe.
Absolutely. And I think that hopefully builds empathy for the folks we work with, is that there is a biological reason for this. I think that really helped me because I saw these, when I worked with everybody I've worked with, I've seen such good people inside, but the behaviors just kind of could keep them stuck. And, that there's a biology that's a reaction to trauma and high levels of stress that unfortunately can keep them stuck in, like you said, these behavioral patterns.
Exactly. The last thing I want to say is there's also a biology that allows us to resonate with their internal states.
Mm-hmm.
So not only do we have to understand what's going on with them, but we have to understand when we interact with them, we're going to resonate. And so we have to have the ability to stay within our cortex to be able to help them feel safe. They're actually borrowing those processes for us. So it's not easy being around people who live in a world that's so dangerous.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in about the 10 minutes we have left, I want to talk about some of the high road impact on this. So as we talked about, if I'm cognitively engaged and regulated, we send it up through the cortex. Now, for those with trauma, this isn't a slam dunk that now all of a sudden I'm going to be able to focus, because a lot of folks have unresolved traumatic memories up there. And this can trigger what we call that re-traumatization response. Now, again, this is a functional adaptation. For some reason, recently I've been being cut off by guys driving slow in the fast lane on the interstate and Audis talking on cell phones. So my cortex, when I see a guy, and I don't know why they're not using their Bluetooth, it makes no sense to me, and why they want to scratch up their Audi on my car. But like when I see a guy driving 15 miles under the speed limit in an Audi in the fast lane, my cortex reminds me is, hey, this person has, been a little bit of a threat, even though it's not the same guy that cut me off last time. I also find that if you're in a BMW or a Mercedes and you're talking on the cell phone driving slow in the fast lane, I also get a little bit of cortisol release. And my brain's telling me, hey, get around this guy, because people like that have caused you harm in the past. Now, when we translate that into our folks who've experienced a lot of abuse and neglect, I had a young lady come into my school. She was about 11 years old. And I'd met her at this initial meeting, and I was sitting down at the time. And if you don't know me, I'm kind of freakishly tall at 6'7". And so I was sitting down, we had a good talk, and she was coming to the new school, and a lot of kids, because it was a special education school, transitions were really hard for these kids. So a lot of times their first day at the school was one of their hardest. So she gets off the bus, and weirdly, because this isn't what we saw a lot of times, she had a smile on her face. And I'm like, well, what do we do with this, right? We were all ready for behaviors and this, that, and the other, and she gets off with a smile on her face. And she sees me, and she goes, Matt, and starts running up to me, and looks like she's going to hug me, but let's start with a handshake kind of thing. And she goes, it's really good to be here. And I'm like, it's really good to see you. And then all of a sudden, you see this switch. I immediately switch. And on one hand, on one moment, a second earlier, I had an 11-year-old girl with ponytails and a smile on her face. The next minute, like Satan himself took over her body. And I was unfortunately standing in a very open, welcoming stance. And she put her foot right into my crotch. And I'm like, okay, what happened here? Right? I thought she was on this high, long road. I thought she was happy to be here. And I got her file later on that day. We had a policy change that after that, we got the file before the kid because my reproductive future was highly threatened because she took me down with that kick. And I read in her file that she had been sexually assaulted at her old school by a janitor who was 6'5". And it was weird to see this because I don't think I was the first one she did this to, and talked in a loud voice. And if you know me, I can't whisper to save my life. And so even if we're on that high, long road and enough variables of what's going on in our environment triggers one of those unresolved traumatic memories, it can bring the energy of that trauma back into the situation. And I don't think she, I talked to her later on after I could walk straight again. And she was really, she told me, and it kind of broke my heart, is I was really excited to come to school because I thought there'd be kids here like me. So she really did get off the bus in a very good place. But as she got closer to me, I got taller. And when I opened my mouth, all of a sudden there were enough things about me that remind her of her traumatic experience. So when we have these traumatic memories in our cortex, we can go from seeming very regulated, even socially engaged, to re-traumatized I've seen people do it, just a word that you use. I know we've all shared this experience as well, is you go into a dorm or a cottage with residential. I see this with guys too, but girls just kind of struck me as much more of a visceral experience. If there's a male staff working one shift, it's one feel in that dorm or cottage, and then the female comes on and it's a very different feel, depending on sort of their experiences. And for a lot of kids I've worked with their abuse. So we see those unresolved traumatic memories can really pull us back in, even if we're on that high, long road. And the last piece of this that I want to just touch on before I get you guys' final thoughts on this is also that we see coming out of the neurobiological research is the prefrontal cortex is actually smaller in size. So the tragedy of this is, the prefrontal cortex is so critical to success in academics, and later on with employment, when we have to really bring cognitive thinking into our environment. And being smaller in size not only hurts our intellectual capacity, but it also limits the prefrontal cortex ability to keep the amygdala regulated as well. So if you think about what we talked about last episode with the cup analogy, again, with our folks sometimes, it's not just a big stress that will take us to the low road, but accumulated stress over time. And we just know that a lot of people, again, because of biology, have a lot of harder time regulating that amygdala on a kind of a minute-to-minute, second-to-second basis because of that, the less development of the prefrontal cortex. So just want to kind of get you guys any final thoughts. I know we've gone through a lot today, but any final thoughts on this model, kind of lessons taken away, suggestions for the folks listening?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We did a lot. It's a lot to kind of go through, and the implications of each point along the way are really critical. So I think the good news is that there's always so much exciting stuff to learn about how the brain interacts with the environment and how that drives behavior and how that can change things very rapidly. And I think one of the things that I kind of take away from it is having an understanding or a lens with which to view the symptoms that we see helps us to stay engaged with people long enough to provide enough repetitions to start to be reparative. And I think that's a kind of a critical point here, is that, and Jerry, you were making it earlier, of that getting the cortex involved in putting context to what's going on in the lower areas of the brain is a critical step to take, and one time is not enough. It takes lots of times of that to happen. And so I think that's one of the big values of having a lens to view those things through, is it helps you to understand them and helps you to not be as frustrated with them, and to stay engaged with people long enough to provide enough reparative experiences to help make a difference.
Jerry, any last thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I have two thoughts. One is, I wonder what your body, I now know that if you see BMWs on the road, you have this kind of reaction. I'm wondering if you see little girls running at you.
Another reaction.
Another reaction.
Yeah, I stand in a
We're
much
learning about what the triggers are in your life. Because there's some things for triggering.
I learned, that defensive stance. The
That's right.
Stance, trust has to be created, yes.
So I want to take that little example, and I don't want to say a lot, but just in one moment, that little girl was socially engaged.
Yeah.
And when something triggered it, her ability to be socially engaged any longer, she moved to a defensive response to the environment automatically, right? And I think going back to what Curt said about when are people ready to engage in an intervention, right? And I think the issue really is not whether they're engaged for an intervention, but what intervention do they need to activate the part of the brain that's online, right? So she had a very different part of her brain that was activated when she was running off the bus and talking to you as opposed to when she was reacting. And if we're not matched with our interventions to address the part of the brain that's there, so, what's going to help them regulate? Then what's going to help them to connect and relate? And then what's going to help them to have some reasoning and understanding of it? If we're providing some reasoning understanding to people when they're in that part of their lower brain, then our intervention is a mismatch to what they actually need. So it isn't necessarily the intervention, but the kind of the relationship between the intervention and the state that the client is in is important to understand. So I think I want to leave it with that, and maybe we could spend some more time talking about that on another podcast. But that young lady changed states. Mm-hmm. And if I was doing the same intervention with her that she was in her kind of happy brain, I would have missed that. It wouldn't have worked, or vice versa. So I think as a clinician, as a case manager, as a teacher, we have to understand both what we're doing, but what state the person we're trying to interact is in to kind of be open and receptive to it.
Absolutely. And I think it's just such a great point to take away is, whatever model we decide to use, the thing I do like about looking at different brain areas is there's really this biology that's created with growing up in traumatic experiences, in dangerous environments. And so when we think about, the larger amygdala, smaller hippocampus, smaller prefrontal cortex, all this biological stuff, it really, for me also helps, as Jerry, you were kind of mentioning too, the complexity of trying to find the right variables to help people heal. It's going to be hard for them to gain emotional regulation if they're going home every night and worried about their safety, or they have to, like a lot of kids I worked with, that they were worried about getting harmed, if not shot, on the way home from school. And then there's the traumatic memories that for a lot of people, once we help them regulate through mindfulness or other things, then helping to release some of those traumatic memories for some as part of their healing process, all trying to build the prefrontal cortex and helping heal this brain. And so I think it just shows the complexity and hopefully gives our audience a lot of empathy for these kids, and the adults that these kids grow up to be didn't choose to have this biology. This was a survival reaction that probably kept a lot of folks alive, and trying to get the right variables and right relational factors in place is not an easy thing to do, but is worth the journey as well. So again, we've covered a lot today. Traumainformedlens.org, episode 21. We have some discussion questions that we've been putting up over the last episode. I've also written a couple blog posts going through what we covered today too. So if you're like so overwhelmed because we covered so much, that would give you a good review as well. Because I think the last thing I do, and I know we've talked about this going forward, the better we understand the brain, the better we can help teach others that, some of their struggles are because they're survivors and they've been able to survive these situations. So hopefully to give you a lot of resources there, and thanks for spending another hour with us. And Jerry, Curt, as always, it's a pleasure to learn from you and with you, my friends. So I wish everybody a great week, and we'll see you next week for episode 22.
Thanks.